begin our discussion of other social movements that occurred in the 60s and 70s with a discussion about Latinos and Native Americans. Now, to begin with, I want to focus on the comparisons between their goals and tactics. I think that it's interesting to compare these groups of Americans because they're very similar in the sense that basically Latinos were the combining of two cultures back before the United States was formed. And then also the idea that Latinos make up a very big culture in the United States because not only do they include Mexican Americans, but a Latino is somebody who may come from Cuba, may come from Puerto Rico, may come from Guatemala or Brazil or Colombia. This term Latino is often used to describe various different cultures coming from Central South America and the Caribbean. And it's interesting because many of them have found their political voice through the Mexican American community, which is one of the larger Latino communities in the US. And so when we start to see a lot of social change or a lot of movement for civil rights, we see kind of an interesting goal. It's not so much about civil rights and equality because a lot of that is achieved from African Americans in the civil rights movement, but a lot of it is economic and it's ideas of wanting better working conditions, better pay, and ultimately a recognition of culture. Now, we're seeing today an expansion of a lot of that social change because early on in the 1960s and 70s, most Latinos lived in the Southwest along the area of Mexico or in Florida, which was very close to Cuba or Puerto Rico. And those were the largest numbers of our Latino Americans. Eventually now that population has spread and migrated throughout the United States. And so there's been a push of this recognition of culture throughout America. The tactics that they used initially, and today it's mostly political and very locally being challenged and changed with things like EL classes. When I started teaching 15 years ago, bilingual coursework was not something you did. And so that change has happened very quick. I've seen it myself where we have active bilingual classes. This all started with somebody named Chavez, who did a lot of union working with migrant farm workers, which migrant farm workers made the majority of the population of some of our early Latino Americans, particularly in the areas of California and Arizona. There also was a political group that was working for like bilingual schools in California, like La Raza Unada. And these groups really started the process of gaining equality for Latinos. Most of the Native Americans in North America were from tribal groups that were here in this part of the country in the Middle West, like where Minnesota was, or in the Northeast. There aren't as many groups in the Northeast or Southwest anymore because many of them were pushed into the western part of the United States. But again, Native Americans had very similar goals. High unemployment in that culture and in reservations where they were mostly living now because of the American government's pushing these cultural groups into those areas, had very low economic systems on these reservations and very much high death rates because of very poor, low, or non-existent health care. The tactics that they used were very different, though. Part of what was called the American Indian movement sought to change and gain support through the court system, which is interesting because that's how many of the Cherokee Indians fought for equality way back during the Trail of Tears when Andrew Jackson was pushing them off their land in Georgia. But in the 1960s, under the AIM, this is often pushed again of suing the American government for rights and for autonomy on their native land and their land. Many of the reservations, if you don't know this, are autonomous, which means that they have control over their government and their police force, and so the American government cannot dictate laws on those reservations. But when certain rights weren't given, many native tribes did react with violence, and there were examples of different incidents that occurred, especially in the 1970s, where federal agents would try to enforce some sort of resistance with actual violence to try to get somebody to change or do something with laws. In a specific way where this was happening, really, which is interesting, were in the laws that were against fishing and hunting. A lot of the native tribes were doing what was considered illegal by the DNR, which is hunting or fishing on lands that technically were not legal. And so there was oftentimes conflict that happened with American or local law enforcement and the native cultures or tribes in a certain region resisting those laws. So these are some of the goals and tactics for Latinos and Native Americans. There is an assignment that you have to do with some added links where you can read in more depth about these groups. But this is where we begin our discussion about social change.